Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 12 of constitutional law. Here we are, the end of a long term, but I think, one that has come quite quickly. I feel like the last few weeks have really flown by. So our final topic for the term, looking at constitutional change. And of course, with a referendum right around the corner, what better time to be talking about this and be considering what is a really important issue. Um, Even before that really significant date on the 14th, you've got another really significant date on the 12th, which will be your exam. So I've also promised that we'll spend a lot of time talking about that and going through. We've talked before about some of the things that you can be doing to prepare for the exam in terms of uh, taking really good notes and preparing exam scripts and I suppose in terms of from an understanding perspective and conveying your knowledge perspective, how to prepare for the exam. But I do want to spend a bit of time today talking through, I guess, some of the more logistical elements and what to expect um, on the day and what to expect from the exam and how to best prepare for those elements. So broadly, as I see it, we've got three things to really talk about tonight. We've got constitutional change and in particular the voice, and I'm keen to allow for some time to discuss that, ask questions, that sort of thing. The exam itself and how to prepare and questions that you might have about the exam, and then the sort of the revision elements and how to synthesize your knowledge and understanding of the past few weeks. So what I'm proposing to do is to spend the first half of the tutorial on the exam, because I figure that's probably the more immediate or pressing concern that you have, and then spend the second half of the tutorial talking about constitutional change and specifically the voice. So unless there's any really strong opinions about doing that the other way around, please speak now or put an opinion in the chat. I think that way will be the most efficient and most valuable way to structure our time tonight. So, having heard no objections, let's get into it. So, first things first, just running through again some of the logistics of the exam itself. So, this is an invigilated exam. This will be something that's new to a lot of you. The way that will work is you'll need to log into a Zoom session, and I'll show you where those can be found in a minute. Try and get into the exam room ideally about 15 minutes before, so 8:45 Queensland time. And that's so that the invigilator can get everyone into the Zoom room and go through the ID checks. Now, the invigilated exam guidelines spell out that you should be using your student ID. I've had some questions today about people not being able to get student ID or the student office saying that there's delays in that sort of stuff. I'm instructing the invigilators that a driver's license is fine under these circumstances, because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to verify your identity, and a driver's license proves that just as well as student ID. So if you can, I definitely say put an application in for that student ID. You'll need it in future terms as well. You get student discounts and all that sort of stuff. So, definitely try and get one. But if you can't get it, or if it doesn't arrive in time, a driver's license will do just fine as well. So making sure that you've logged in early enough, making sure that you've updated Zoom, ideally like the night before. Zoom, just sort of out of interest, and for those of you here tonight, maybe it's less of an issue compared to those listening to the recording later on. But Zoom just today, Zoom wanted me to do an update. So there's clearly some updates kicking around. Please make sure that you get all of that sorted out the night before or first thing the morning of. because the last thing that you want is to be logging in at 8:55 on the morning of the exam, and then Zoom's telling that it's got 2 hours worth of updates to do, and you can't get in and things like that. So please do make sure that you make sure that the technology aspects are sorted out as well. You'll need to have, so once you're in the Zoom room, you need to have your camera on and your microphone on. That enables the invigilator to see you and hear, just to make sure that there's not someone just to the left of screen feeding you answers or anything like that. But turn your speakers down, so microphone on so that the invigilator can hear you, but turn your volume or your speakers down so that you don't hear everyone else's background noise and typing and coughing and all that sort of stuff in the exam, because that'll be really distracting. What that means is that the invigilators won't be able to speak to you once the exam starts, because you won't be able to hear them. You'll have your volume down. So any communication from the invigilators will be via the Zoom chat. So, they'll give you like, there's half an hour left warning, there's 5 minutes left warning, that sort of stuff. So my suggestion is that just every now and then, just you'll obviously be typing away and in the exam document, but just every now and then, just check back into the Zoom just to make sure that you haven't missed any alerts or notifications from the invigilator. In terms of where do you find your Zoom room, we're a large group, and so you're split across multiple different Zoom sessions. It is really important that you arrive at the right one, because there are only limited spots per Zoom room, and the invigilators are expecting certain groups of people to arrive in each one. So where can you find that information? Under the assessment tab on Moodle, I've spelled out a table here with the different Zoom links. It might ask you for a password. The link might be enough, but just in case it asks you for a password, these are the passwords. And just making sure that you're getting into the right room based on your surname. And so this is your surname as it appears in Moodle. So for some people who have got middle names and stuff that are in the Moodle system, it's whatever Moodle has been identifying you by as your surname, that's the one to go off. And if that might be a source of confusion, you can email me and I can confirm which room you'll be in. So that's I suppose the real nuts and bolts. How do you get to the Zoom room? How do you get to do the exam? Once you're in the Zoom room and the invigilators have done all the ID checks, once it clicks over to 9 o'clock and the exam starts, the exam document will be released to you by the invigilators as an attachment in the Zoom chat. So that's how you get the exam. You then start, and then you submit your answer after the 2.5 hours by uploading the document to Moodle. So like usual, there's a little submission point there. You can't leave the exam room, obviously, until you've made that submission. And once you've made the submission and left, you can't come back in. Pretty standard exam things there. Really quick note on the timing. This has been explained elsewhere, but all times are in Queensland time. So if you're outside of Queensland, daylight savings has just kicked in as well. So just being really clear that that's 9 a.m. Queensland time, 11:30 Queensland time, and there's no submissions after 11:30. If you can't be late to this, you can't submit late to this, you unfortunately get an automatic 0 if you try. So yeah, making sure you're paying really close attention to the timing, and if you're outside Queensland, just factoring that in as well. So that's the real kind of really basic, how do you get to do the exam? Are there any questions on that side of things? So not necessarily content or managing time or anything like that, but just, how do I show up to the right spot level stuff? Any questions on that one? Perfect. In terms of the exam itself, you get, sorry, can we use our phone to log into Zoom? It would be better if you didn't. The issue, so the other thing, and I mean, this is the invigilation guidelines. These are the rules by which this invigilated exam is to be conducted. Your phone needs to be switched to silent and visible through the duration of the exam. Again, the reasoning being to allow the invigilator to make sure that you're not using your phone to contact people, because, you know, on a computer, there's absolutely no other way that you could contact someone other than your phone. So that means that using Zoom from your phone is a bit problematic. If there was a scenario where, you know, your computer or your laptop or whatever didn't have a webcam, that's probably something I'd rather resolve on a case-by-case basis. But general principle, yeah, if you can avoid it, don't do Zoom from your phone. Do it from the computer instead. Any other logistics questions? Excellent. Okay. So in terms of what to expect, you know, that you're in the exam room, the invigilator has sent you the exam document. You open it up. What are you going to see? The first page will be instructions and guidelines, which are, you know, basically a lot of what I've just said to you. The scenario itself. So you'll have one scenario, and from that scenario comes two questions. You answer both questions, they're worth 25 marks each. The questions themselves correspond to particular week's contents. And so, you know, we've talked previously, those potentially examinable topics are weeks 8 to 12. And so, you know, that's basically thinking about judicial powers in weeks 8 and 9, rights being express and implied in weeks 10 and 11, and then constitutional change this week, week 12. The exam will invite you to consider two of those topics in your answers. But then, of course, within that, there are potentially sub elements or subtopics and maybe multiple subtopics. So a good example would be week 10, we looked at express rights as the broad topic. But within that, we looked at a few different types of express rights. We talked about Section 92, freedom of trade and commerce. We looked at Section 5126, 5135, acquisition of property on just terms. We looked at freedom of religion and right to trial by jury. So the exam question might say, you know, consider whether any express rights have been breached, or you know, whether there are any constitutional issues with express rights. But then within that guidance, you need to figure out, okay, well, which express rights might be relevant and that sort of thing. So one scenario, two questions. In terms of the length, and this is one of the questions that I've received beforehand, is to think about what sort of a length of question to expect, and in particular, kind of comparing that back to the tutorial questions. It's very roughly an equivalent length, in the sense that the sort of the scenario-based tutorial questions tend to run around about a page long when you think about the sort of there's a scenario, there's a bit of legislation, and then there's some sort of hypothetical client and their particular situation around about a page. You're getting, I guess, two scenarios. It's only one scenario, but you're getting 2 questions worth of stuff. So the scenario itself runs at about 2 pages long. So if you took 2 tutorial questions and merged them together, that kind of gives you roughly a sense of how long the exam question is, and roughly, you know, how long the responses should be as well. So just some questions in the chat on those points. Do we get reading time? No dedicated reading time. I'll talk about time management in a minute, but no dedicated reading time in the exam itself. And what are the type of questions that could be asked and the word count? So when you say what are the type of questions, do you mean what are the topics, or what will you be asked to comment on? Essay type or problem solving. Okay, cool. Problem solving. So it's very similar to the scenario based problems that we've been looking at in the last few tutorials. In that they give you a broad scenario, some legislation, and then a particular hypothetical client, and you're asked to give comment and advice on, you know, how the Constitution guides us to a resolution of that issue for that client. So similar in that sense, you know, it'll be broadly, the question is advise A, advise B, whatever, you know, the client. So in terms of word count, this is a soft word count in the, you know, if you go a little bit over, it doesn't really matter. I would think that you would be able to get this done in less than 2,000 words. You know, if it took you 2,000, if you went a little bit over, that would be fine. The word count is more there to stop you just copy and pasting your notes in the hopes that like something in the answer is relevant. Because, you know, technically if you just uploaded all your notes from weeks 8 to 12, you know, you get a rubbish mark for application. But in terms of the identifying the relevant law, technically it's kind of all there. So, you know, the having the word count is to stop that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily like you've done 2001 words, I'm stopping reading, that kind of thing. So roughly 2,000 words, a bit under, fine, a bit over, fine. If you were coming in at significantly under, like, so, you know, like 1,000 words, I'd be worried that you hadn't answered enough. So very roughly 2,000 words. Should you use IRAC? You can. I think we sort of talked about this in the midterm task, and the ideas apply here as well, in that you'll want to be, the most important thing is that you are successfully identifying the relevant rules, so constitutional provisions, and then the tests and cases and high court decisions that have gone into interpreting and understanding the constitutional text, and then demonstrating a strong understanding of those tests and cases by providing an application that has critical analysis and good use of legal reasoning. If structuring an answer via IRAC is the best way that you can consolidate your thinking, and especially, you know, in only 2.5 hours, you may not have time to do anything too fancy. If IRAC helps you think most clearly about the problem and highlights in particular that application, go for it. But it's not if you gave an answer that said all the right things and contained all the right nuance, but didn't follow IRAC, it just, discussed the issues in a more flowing way, that would be fine too. So use IRAC if it helps, but if it doesn't help, don't worry about it. Do we need to provide full citations, or could it be short to save time? So I think I've talked about this before. You need to use citations and appropriately reference, in that if you're talking about ideas that are not your own, or when you're referring to the key cases and that sort of stuff, that needs to be cited. Your answers don't necessarily need to be 100% AGLC perfectly formatted. Now, the advantage of doing this exam on the computer is that in your notes, you can have the full citations there written out, ready to go. And, it's quicker to just cut and paste those notes across into your footnotes than it is to just type out a shorthand for that reference, let's say. So really, there's no reason why you couldn't provide full citations. I'm very flexible on the IBIDs and the above N5s and that sort of stuff. I think is way too finicky for the time limit. And as time gets tight, not providing the full citation, as long as it's clear, very clearly identifiable what the case is and that sort of stuff, it's fine. But ideally, there's no reason why you can't provide full citations for a lot of the exam. Let's talk about time management. So we know that when you open this up, you're going to have 2 questions. It's a really, one of the things, and as a first year subject, this might be an idea that's new to some of you. Maybe you've heard it before. This idea of, the law of diminishing returns, or in an exam, the law of diminishing marks, in that the first few marks to any question are easier to get than the last few. And so I would really, really strongly encourage you, that there's 2 questions. Try and divide your time up equally between the 2. So within 2.5 hours, I'd give yourself about 1 hour and 15 on each question. And the reason for that is, by having it's better to have a solid or a good attempt at both questions than it is to have a fantastic answer to one question and a really rushed, limited answer to the second question. And I see this all the time. I see a really fantastic answer to the early question or early questions, and then 2 sentences on the last question or something like that. And it just shows, okay, you ran out of time. And the difficulty with that is, let's say you spent 2 hours on question 1, and only gave yourself half an hour for question 2. Spending all that time on question 1 might have gotten you, up to 23 out of 25 instead of 19 out of 25, let's say. But because you had so little time, you only get 4 out of 25 on question 2. Whereas if you balanced your time equally, you might be able to get 19 out of 25 on both questions. And then your mark across the exam as a whole is obviously much, much higher. So try and divide your time equally between the 2 questions, and really sort of stick to that. I think there's you can go into the exam thinking, oh yeah, I'll do it equally, and then you get to halfway through and you feel like, I've only got 2 more paragraphs left to write for question 1. I'll just finish that off, and then 2 paragraphs becomes 3 paragraphs, and then suddenly you've run out of time. So really be strict with yourself. Just even if it's a half, hopefully not half finished, but even if it's a slightly unfinished answer, just move on and get as much done in question 2 as you can. And then if you've got time left at the end, come back to question 1. One approach that you might like to do, and this comes back to the earlier question about reading time, I encourage you to give yourself the chance to really sit with the question. The temptation will be, given the limited time, to just dive in and just try and start writing as soon as possible. And I think the problem with that approach is that you will, it's easy to just start writing the first thing that you think about and just run down that pathway, and then you'll miss some of the other points because you just started writing straight away. And so, back when we used to do paper exams, you'd see it where like there'd be like a page and a half of written answer, and then it would all just be scribbled out because they realized, they just started writing and then went back to the question and reread it again, and then went, oh, that actually wasn't right. Okay, now I have to start again. So really fight that impulse to just start writing straight away. Give yourself the time to sit with the exam. And so I'd suggest spending, even 15, 20 minutes, maybe even half an hour, just really thoroughly reading the question and planning out your answer to both questions. So really brainstorming, and this is an exercise that we've been doing right throughout the term, right? Brainstorming all the ideas, all the reactions that you're having, all the little details that seem to be relevant. Use that first half an hour to just flick back through your notes and double check things. We've talked before about having the sort of the rough structures mapped out for answers and those sorts of things. Really use that first bit of time to really plan out your answer. And then once you dive into actually writing, it'll go a lot smoother because you already know what you want to say. And then it's just a matter of spending the next 2 hours just getting it done and just saying everything that you need to say. But you won't be wasting as much time. Oh, I thought of that. Flick back through the notes, write something down. Oh, but what about this? Flick back through the notes. Oh, I can't remember where those notes were, all that sort of stuff. It just wastes time. So if you give yourself the time to do all that thinking up front, you'll have a smoother experience into the exam itself. I think that raises another point around organizing your notes. Spend some time and give some thought as to how you're going to organize your notes, whether that's on the computer or whether that's printed out next to you. Think about, are you going to have separate documents for each week's content, or is it all going to be consolidated into one? Are you going to have some sort of keywords that you use throughout that you can easily control find to navigate? Are you going to use bookmarks, or if it's printed out, post-it notes? Have some systematic way that makes sense to you that will allow you to navigate your notes really easily, because you don't have the time, frankly, in the exam to be scrolling, trying to find a particular case or trying to half remember something. Make life easy. Spend the time now to make life easy for yourself in the exam proper. Any other exam questions? So the only other thing that I've been asked from a revision perspective is just to talk a little bit more and give a little bit more clarification and guidance as to state judicial power, and in particular thinking about how to navigate and think about state judicial power questions. My main response to that question, or broadly, if that's something that you're struggling with, I think the the sort of the example structure that I posted after the tutorial, I think really sets out a good way of thinking about state judicial power questions, and really coming back to this idea that, and this applies to federal and state, but the core idea here is that we're trying to preserve the institutional integrity of the court. We're trying to avoid the application of non-judicial power to Chapter 3 courts, which can be federal or state courts, in a way that would undermine public confidence in the independence and the integrity of those judicial bodies. So more than anything else, if you can just get really solidly in your mind that that's what is at the core of these cases and these issues, I think that's a really important sort of touchstone to keep coming back to. And then from there, you kind of build up and think about, okay, so our core idea is we want to protect institutional integrity. Okay, well, what are the kinds of things that would undermine that institutional integrity? And so that's where the case law builds on. And so in particular with state judicial power, thinking about the imposition of the various bikie laws across the different states. These are collectively examples or adding or elaborating on these ideas of, okay, well, what types of powers, when given to state courts, undermine institutional integrity? So you think about something like Totani, this idea that where the court functionally gives up their ability to decide and their discretion to the executive, that's a problem. Whereas if there is still some capacity to decide or some ability for the court to reach its own conclusion and its own decision, then it's not so problematic. Where we're looking at scenarios where the executive is predetermining an outcome and the court's just rubber stamping it, that's when we're starting to find problems. So coming back to that as a core mechanism, and then building your understanding of the case law and being able to draw analogies to the facts of the different cases is a really good way of solidifying your understanding of state judicial power. So that's the exam. Just one final question in the chat, one scenario and two questions. Yep. So one scenario, and from that comes two questions. Any final questions about the exam before we move on to the voice and constitutional change?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Concerning the right to vote. And the question is, should we consider it as an express constitutional right or implied one?
That's a good one. Yeah.
On the one hand, we have Section 41 that no adult may be deprived of the vote at Commonwealth level if they vote for the lower house for his state legislature. Yes, I think we need to have a precise guidance here.
Yep. Absolutely. And it's a quirk, and it's one that people may very well disagree with the court's view on this, and they're perfectly welcome to that view. Express as the right is in Section 41, as you've said, at this point in time, it should be regarded as an implied right, because Section 41 has been interpreted as only applying to people who were given the right to vote in 1901. Very few, if any, would be alive today. Actually, they would have been probably would have been less than 18 in 1909 anyway. So yeah, so there's no one around to whom Section 41 applies anymore, and so the interpretation is that the right to vote is an implied right rather than an express one. And you are more than welcome to disagree with the reasoning, but for the purposes of the exam, treat it as an implied right rather than an express one. Excellent. Well, speaking of voting, I think that segues us really nicely into talking about the voice and the upcoming referendum and tying it back to these broader ideas around constitutional change. And I thought, and we talked about this last week, I've sort of thrown out the tutorial questions for tonight, given that they were written in a time before we knew that the voice vote was going to be so close to this tutorial. And so I think it's more useful to us to have a discussion based on where the campaign is at and the interesting themes and ideas and debates that are being had about the voice as it stands, rather than necessarily where that debate and where those ideas were a few months ago. So I'm keen for this to be a more, I suppose, more open discussion. The voice is something that I have spent a lot of time researching and unpacking. So if it turns into more of a Q&A of me, that's fine, but it's not necessarily my intention. I'd rather this be a more open discussion of maybe, you don't have to necessarily say whether you support or disagree with the voice, but on reflection now, you've done 12 weeks of constitutional law. You've got a greater understanding of the Constitution compared to most people in the average population. And so that gives you a different perspective or a different understanding of the issues. And I think it's a great way to round out our consideration of this unit by having a more informed discussion about the voice and the ideas that the proposed change to the Constitution that it aims to make. So I thought we could start off however you like, really. Maybe just some initial interesting reactions that you've had, either personally, things that you found interesting, or things that you've noticed in your own life. So maybe you've received campaign material for either side that you thought was interesting. Maybe you've had conversations with family or people at work or whoever. So keen to just get some initial reactions and ideas that what's leaping out to you about this referendum.
I guess it's just that we are going to a referendum, but we're not sure what we are actually up to, because the government hasn't given the clear guidelines. What is that involved? How is that going to be affected? And as I previously said, the government has absolute power to make laws, whatever they want, and they did in previously. There are so many First Nation policies in Australia, but not understanding, even the government itself, not in the favor of the Commonwealth as a Commonwealth. They want to be republic, and not sure why they want to make a constitutional change when they don't have a mind. Absolutely, I'm sure when they go for a republic, there's a minister already appointed as for a republic, and they want to make a constitutional change. When they're actually going for a republic, this constitution is not going to be in part of the republic. They will rewrite that for sure. So that's my understanding. So I'm not very clear what's the urgency of doing that one when they're actually going for a republic.
Okay. The Republic take is an interesting one. The idea, and you're right, we did talk last week about, you know, the difference between the legislative versus the constitutional approaches. The idea around detail is a really important one, though, I think, in terms of it is a common theme that's been coming up in this campaign around the level of detail that's included in the proposal, the what's being put to the people versus what's available elsewhere, and all that sort of stuff. So I wonder if that's something that other people have come across or reacted to as well.
I feel that there's a lot of misinformation coming from both sides of the fence. I think, or I don't even have any proof to back it up, but it feels almost like each side is just bending the story to whatever they need to get their vote across the line, regardless of what's true or not. Like at the beginning, it was all the unknown, and now there seems to be a lot of knowns, but how true they are, I have no idea.
Yeah, and the misinformation thing is really fascinating in general, right? Because it's I agree. I think that there has been a lot of misinformation and disinformation. The difference being, you know, misinformation might be a genuinely held but mistaken belief versus disinformation, which is, you know, the active misleading or you know, making statements without regard to whether or not they're true. And I think that there's both of those things going on. It raises this really interesting idea, though, around public education, and in particular the referendum pamphlet. And I think it's something that I talked about in the lecture video, but this idea that there's a role for just as much as possible independent or impartial education to explain what the proposal is, what the likely effects are, and all of that doesn't go into necessarily attempting to persuade people to vote one way or the other, and you know, having the education or having some education. I think both sides are perfectly entitled to make their point and try and persuade people, but to also have a sort of a more impartial source of information that people can go to. And there are resources out there that do that or try to do that, but they're not well known. They're not necessarily well publicized, and I think that itself has probably been a real shame within the campaign itself. And yeah, I don't think, to the extent that education exists, I don't think it can combat the levels of misinformation and disinformation that are out there in the campaign. Absolutely. What about any other thoughts or responses or ideas?
I guess going back to the vagueness of it and not actually knowing what it's going to look like, that was something that I was thinking before doing this unit, but now having gone through it and seeing how I guess vague the Constitution is not a very detailed document and thorough with things. It's all about interpretation by the courts and Parliament. So I guess that doesn't worry me so much now. But I guess I'm just intrigued if it were to go through, whether they would stick with how the voice has been so far, or whether there'll be a new interpretation of it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's I mean I think you're very right in that the level of detail that's included in the proposed section 129 is consistent with the level of detail that's included in other constitutional provisions. And when you think all of this is occurring in the context of a document that doesn't even mention the Prime Minister and stuff like that, there's scope or there's a basis for it to not necessarily include all the detail. And part of this as well really comes back to the 99 Republic referendum, which the research suggests was defeated in the end by the exact model that was proposed. So for those who maybe aren't quite so familiar, the context of the 99 referendum was that it seems as though a majority of people were in favor of Australia becoming a republic, but the specific model of republic that was put forward in the referendum was to have a president that would be chosen by Parliament, rather than a president or some head of state that's directly chosen by the people. And so that it seems that split the vote. There were people who wanted the republic but didn't want a head of state chosen by politicians, and so they voted no, even though they supported the idea of the republic in general. And I think we're seeing echoes of that in the Voice, where there's a reluctance to get too far down into the weeds of exactly what model the Voice will have and that sort of stuff, out of fear that people might like the Voice but might not like the exact form of voice that's being proposed, and so they might be encouraged to vote no. And I think that strategically that view makes sense, but probably what hasn't been done well is communicating that that's a strength of leaving things out of the Constitution rather than having to include things, right? So arguably, not packing all that detail of like how will members of the Voice be chosen? Will they be elected? Will they be nominated by First Nations communities? There's a lot of thinking that's actually gone into how that would look and how that might work. And there's an initial model that's been proposed. But it makes sense to not include that in the Constitution, because then down the track, if it turns out that that's a method that isn't quite working well, that can be tweaked without having to change the Constitution itself. We see that in the way that parliamentarians are chosen, right? The Senate in particular has gone through an evolution of different ways of electing senators. But that detail's not in the Constitution, so it can be changed and updated over time. And so just from a campaigning perspective, you can see the Yes campaign's hesitance to put that detail out there. And it seems, as far as I can tell with the polling, it seems to be hurting them by not including that detail. Whereas it seems like with I guess it's not hindsight until the vote happens, but it seems as though a stronger approach might have been to say, here's the core that will go in the Constitution, and then here's the supplementary stuff that will that Parliament will deal with. if you don't like this exact model, that's fine. Don't worry about that. You can still vote yes, and then tell us the parts that you don't like about the detail, because that can be easily changed and updated and progress with times. And it's a level of nuance that hasn't really filtered into the debate itself. To the point about how will the voice be interpreted by the High Court, there's no guarantees, obviously, and having studied this unit, you know that better than most people. But it's not a complete Wild West frontier. There are, over 100 years worth of established ways that the courts will be willing to look at things and interpret things, and all of that experience has gone into the drafting. What's potentially more open to divergent views is with a change in government, a lot of how the voice functions in day-to-day practice won't be in the Constitution. As I said, that'll be dealt with by Parliament, and so that is liable to change. And so, to the extent that what's the vision for the voice that's being put forward now versus what does it look like in 10 years' time, 50 years' time, it seems as though it's more likely that changes to that vision would come from Parliament rather than judicial interpretation. And that can be a positive thing. That can be updating the voice over time to reflect with changing needs, or it can be a move away from what's intended, or what sort of positives the voice might be able to bring. In the chat, a comment about how people are fearful of how it will affect them personally, and being scared of what it means for them, and that being a fear that comes sort of young and old people alike. It's a really interesting point, and it comes back to, I think, some of the misinformation and the disinformation that we talked about earlier. There's been, and I don't know necessarily what you've seen, but I've seen comments about the voice will you'll lose your house to native title. I've seen things about land tax, and all of that misrepresents the powers of the voice that are would be, if it succeeds, would be established in the Constitution. So really important to know and remember that the voice is only there to make representations to the government and to Parliament, which means they're only an advisory body. They're not making the policy, they're not enacting legislation, they're not implementing or enforcing policy or regulations or anything like that. So extremely unlikely that the voice would suggest some of the sorts of things that have been claimed. I'd almost guarantee that it wouldn't come up. But even if it did, Parliament would still have the power to say, no, that's insane, we're not doing that. The executive government would still have the power to say, no, we're not going to impose more taxes on people and things like that. So it's you're very right to sort of note that there are these pockets of people who are very fearful of those sorts of things, and it seems to be coming very much from misrepresentation or misunderstandings of what's proposed. any other, and I'm saying all this very conscious that I come across as someone in favor of the voice. I think you could probably guess that I am, and it's a position that I've reached after a lot of research and a lot of consideration. Everyone, of course, is more than entitled to their own view, and if you're more than welcome to disagree with me, and more than welcome to not support the voice. I guess where I'm coming from is, let's have a debate about the proposal and the merits based on what's actually being proposed and what's actually likely, rather than a lot of the misinformation and just some of the frankly wild claims that are out there. But yeah, any other, having said that, maybe that stifles perspective. I'm very open to people.
Sorry, Jacob, can I ask you this?
Yeah.
If, as you said, if the voice doesn't have enforcement power, they only can suggest, and the executive government can reject, then what's the point of having them? Because you gave them a constitutional recognition and they don't have a power, which actually happens now with a lot of other committees. So why we should give something like that so permanent in the constitution, which doesn't have any recognition? It has recognition, but it doesn't have enforcement authority. At the end of the day, executive government says no. So we can just have a committee. What is stopping the government just to make a voice without going to the constitution? They absolutely have a power.
Yeah, it's a good question, and some of this touches on what we talked about last week in terms of why install it in the constitution rather than just having it as a legislative body. In terms of the actual concern about it's got no teeth, it's got no sort of power to actually make the government listen, and that's progressive First Nations people in particular, that's a concern that they have, is that sure, this would be a voice, but there's nothing to compel the government to actually listen to that voice, and that's a fair enough view. The reason to install it in the constitution anyway comes back to the themes we talked about last week around giving, for one, recognition as sort of an objective in its own right, but beyond that, giving the voice constitutional status and constitutional permanency enables it to survive changes in government. And yes, as I've said, changes in government might modify the way it does things, or might change sort of exactly how it performs its function, but as a body itself, it would continue to exist. And that's been something that has been a real challenge in Indigenous policy making in general, is that there have been advisory bodies in the past, but they come and they go. They're not given the opportunity necessarily to give that frank and fearless advice to government. And as a result, they either just tell the government what they think they want to hear, or find themselves dissolved or disestablished. And with each change, with each new advisory body, all this institutional memory, all this experience gets lost and reset. And so the value in having a constitutionally enshrined voice, even if it can't compel the government or parliament to listen to it, brings with it a continuity that will enable the body to build up experience, build up practices that, for one, hopefully make government more likely to listen to it, but it also gives it a power to speak directly to the people more readily. And so even if government or parliament isn't willing to directly listen, having that ability and that permanence to be able to have a conversation with the Australian people more broadly gives it the chance to, make everyone stand up and listen. And as a collective society, Australians are more likely to be able to get the government to listen and change policy and all that sort of thing. So, I can see where you're coming from in terms of, if they're going to be, the risk is that they'll be ignored, why have it in the first place? But yeah, I think that there's the status quo empirically has been demonstrated to not really be working, and the changes that constitutional establishment of a voice would give are more likely to remedy some of those barriers that have prevented previous efforts from achieving good outcomes. Any other final questions or thoughts or comments? How can they get away with all the false information? Because we don't have truth in advertising laws in our elections, and certainly not in our referendums. It's its own thing. But yeah, and part of it comes back to the implied freedom of political communication, although I think that a law that reined in some of the misinformation, I think would have a strong argument that it's proportionate and therefore imposes a legitimate burden. But yeah, basically there's actually very little legally to stop people from spreading or creating false information, which is a bigger problem than we can deal with in this unit. But yeah, is obviously has huge impacts on the way this campaign's playing out. We've clicked over past 8 o'clock, so we will have to leave it there. Thank you all very much for your attention and hard work and engagement throughout this term. I said at the beginning, constitutional law it's not an easy subject. It's one that a lot of people struggle to really grapple with and get their heads around. So, really well done. And I do want to acknowledge the effort that you've all put in this unit to persevere and to figure it out. And, hopefully now at the end of these 12 weeks, you look back and you think, I actually do know a lot more about the Constitution than I did beforehand. So thanks all very much for your effort this term. If you've got questions about the exam and about the content, you're more than welcome to still get in touch by email and Teams. And yeah, best of luck. Maybe some of you I'll see next term in admin law or further down the track. But either way, good luck with the rest of your studies and good luck with the exam next week. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.